The apple trees in the garden were in full bloom, their delicate white flowers swaying in the gentle breeze, as if eager to greet the warm sunlight before the leaves had fully unfurled. It was a time of new beginnings, a season of growth and renewal. The ducks, small and playful, had waddled out of their cozy shelter, their little feet tapping the ground with innocent curiosity. Even the cat had joined them, basking in the sunlight as it licked its paws, savoring the warmth that wrapped around it like a soft, comforting blanket. If you looked out across the field, you would see the fresh green wheat swaying gently in the breeze, as though whispering its own secret to the earth. The birds, too, were active, their songs filling the air, a joyous chorus, as if they were celebrating the day. It felt like a grand festival land. It was Sunday, a day of rest and reflection. Everything around seemed to exude a sense of contentment and happiness. There was peace in the air, and the world, bathed in the soft light of morning, seemed to smile. The bells of the church rang out across the town, their melody resonating in the hearts of the people. Everyone had dressed in their finest clothes, eager to attend the service. Their faces were bright with smiles, their hearts filled with gratitude for the beauty of the day. It was, indeed, a warm and blessed day, and the people could not help but feel the presence of something divine in the air. They whispered to one another, "Our God is good to us." Yet, inside the church, the scene was strikingly different. The preacher stood at the pulpit, his voice raised in anger, filled with a sense of righteousness that almost seemed to consume him. His words were sharp and heavy with condemnation. He spoke of sinners who turned their backs on God, of the wrath they would face. He painted a vivid picture of hell, where the wicked would burn forever in the eternal flames, tormented by their own guilt and regrets. His voice was unyielding as he spoke of their suffering, how it would never end, how they would never find peace. The words were terrifying, delivered with such conviction that they seemed to cut through the congregation like a blade. The people sat in their pews, listening with wide eyes, each word falling heavily upon them. The atmosphere was tense, full of fear and unease. There was no solace in his voice, no warmth, only the certainty of judgment. Outside, the world was alive with beauty. The birds sang, the sun shone brightly, and every flower seemed to smile up at the heavens, as if to say, "God is good to us." It was a stark contrast to the preacher's fiery words. The world outside felt so alive, so full of promise, and yet the words inside the church painted a very different picture, one of fear, punishment, and endless suffering inside the church. The preacher's voice boomed with an intensity that seemed to fill every corner of the room. His words, heavy with anger, painted a picture of the world beyond, of sinners condemned to the eternal flames of hell, their cries echoing through the never-ending night. "You are all walking a fine line," he declared, his voice shaking with fervor. "Turn away from your sins, or you will be cast into the abyss, where the fire will never cease, and your suffering will be eternal." The congregation sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down upon them like a storm cloud, thick with dread. Some clasped their hands tightly in prayer, while others stared at the floor, lost in thought. They had come to the church today for solace, for peace, but now they found themselves consumed with fear. The preacher's words were not of love, but of punishment, a grim reminder that the world they lived in was not a place of grace, but one of constant judgment. Yet, outside, the world was a stark contrast to the words being spoken inside the church. The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the fields and gardens. Birds chirped happily, their songs filling the air with joy, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers in bloom. The apple trees, laden with blossoms, swayed softly in the wind, their flowers fluttering like delicate paper wings. The world outside seemed to breathe with life, as though it were celebrating the goodness of the earth and the gifts it offered. The phoenix-like warmth of the sun seemed to touch every living thing, from the ducks waddling happily in the grass to the cat basking lazily in the sun's embrace. Even the smallest flowers seemed to open their petals in reverence to the light, as if saying, "This is a gift, a blessing." But inside the church, none of this beauty could be seen or felt. Instead, the air was thick with the preacher's words, each one a heavy stone cast upon the shoulders of those who listened. The people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, each one feeling the sting of the preacher's condemnation, as if their sins, real or imagined, were being paraded before the judgment of God. The preacher's fire-filled words had found a home in their hearts, replacing the peace and joy they had once felt. It was as though the love of God, which they had come to worship, had been overshadowed by fear, by an insistent voice warning them of eternal damnation. But outside, the day continued to unfold in its simple beauty, unaffected by the preacher's words. The ducks quacked in delight as they splashed in the pond. The little flowers swayed with the wind, and the trees stood tall and strong, their blossoms swaying in time with the breeze. Life continued, full of hope and promise, and the world outside seemed to echo a message of love and grace. The contrast was striking the peace of the earth against the fire of condemnation. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was a nagging feeling that lingered in the preacher's words. Was the world truly as bleak as he painted it? Or was there something more? Could there be hope in the midst of all the suffering, something beyond the endless cycle of sin and punishment? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, the birds sang their songs of hope. The sun continued its warm embrace, and the world outside seemed to carry a message of beauty and peace. But inside, the storm of fear and judgment raged on, and the people sat in silence, unsure of what to believe. That evening, after the church service had ended, the preacher returned to his home, his mind still heavy with the fire of his sermon. He had spoken with such certainty, such passion, that he was almost convinced of the truth of his own words. But as he entered his house and saw his wife sitting silently by the hearth, an unexpected sense of unease began to creep into his heart. The warmth of the home, the flickering firelight, and the soft hum of evening seemed to contrast sharply with the storm that still raged within him. His wife, usually so full of life and warmth, sat motionless, her hands folded quietly in her lap. There was a distant look in her eyes, a quiet sorrow that he couldn't quite place. For a moment, he simply stood in the doorway, watching her, unsure of what to say. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he spoke. "What is it, my dear?" he asked softly, stepping closer to her. "Why do you sit so still, lost in thought?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and confusion. "I've been thinking," she replied, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I've been thinking about your words today. about what you said in the church. The preacher's face tightened. He had already rehearsed his sermon 1,000 times in his mind, and he was ready to defend every word. But his wife's gentle tone, the quiet pain in her eyes, gave him pause. "What about my words?" he asked, though he already knew where this conversation was headed. "You spoke with such certainty," she began, "but there's something in my heart that cannot accept it. You spoke of eternal punishment, of fire that never dies, of sinners cast into the depths of hell, ... And I wonder, how could a God of such mercy and love condemn his creation to such suffering forever and ever?" Asterisk, the preacher's brows furrowed, and for a moment he was silent, as if her words had struck a chord deep within him. "I speak the truth," he replied, though his voice held less conviction than before. "It is written, is it not? The wicked shall suffer for their sins, and their punishment shall be eternal. The fire of hell does not relent." "But how can that be?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I am not a scholar, but I know in my heart that the God we serve is a God of compassion, a God of mercy. How could he, in his wisdom, allow such endless torment for his children? Even those who have done wrong, they are not beyond his love. How can he cast them into an abyss of fire with no hope of redemption?" The preacher stared at her, his mind racing. His wife's gentle voice seemed to shake the very foundations of his beliefs, and a small seed of doubt began to grow in his heart. Could it be true? Could the divine love he had preached about truly be as narrow and unforgiving as he had described it? Asterisk, you speak of mercy, he said, his voice growing softer, as though he were questioning his own convictions. But how can mercy exist in the face of such sin? How can one who has rejected the path of righteousness be allowed to find peace? "I do not know the answers," his wife replied, standing now, her hands reaching out to him, as though she were trying to bridge the distance between them. "But I believe that our God is greater than the fire of hell, greater than any punishment. His love must be greater than our mistakes, greater than our sins." The preacher stood there, staring at his wife, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He had spent his life preaching the wrath of God, the judgment of sin, but now, in the quiet of their home, he was faced with a question he had never truly considered. Was God truly as merciful as she believed? Could the love of God truly encompass all, even the worst of sinners? Or was his own vision of God too narrow, too focused on punishment and fear? Before he could respond, his wife turned and walked to the window, gazing out at the stars that were beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. "I cannot believe in a God who would create his children only to see them suffer forever," she whispered, almost to herself. "I believe in a God who heals, who forgives, and who offers redemption." The preacher watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had always believed that he understood God's will, but now he wasn't so sure. What if he had been wrong? What if God's love was more infinite, more boundless than he had ever imagined? Could it be possible that his own fear-driven beliefs were holding him back from understanding the true nature of divine love? And so, as the evening wore on, the preacher sat quietly, pondering his wife's words. The world outside was still, the only sound, the faint rustling of the leaves in the cool night air. It was a night of reflection, of doubt, of searching. The preacher once so certain, now found himself wondering if his own faith could be reshaped, if he could open his heart to a greater understanding of the mercy and love of God. As the days passed, the preacher's thoughts remained occupied by his wife's words. They echoed in his mind, replaying like a haunting melody that refused to fade. The certainty he had once held so firmly was now a fragile thread, unraveling with each passing moment. The vision of God he had preached for years, the image of a wrathful, punishing deity, began to feel less like truth and more like a shadow, a distortion of the divine light he had once believed in so passionately. His wife had spoken of mercy, of grace, and in her voice he had heard something that stirred a deep longing in his own heart, a longing for a faith that could embrace the fullness of God's love, not one that demanded suffering in exchange for salvation. But the more he tried to reconcile her words with his own beliefs, the more he found himself conflicted. How could he let go of the image of a punishing God when it had been the cornerstone of his life's work? How could he reconcile the idea of divine mercy with the certainty of eternal damnation that he had preached so often? One evening, after a long day of contemplation, the preacher found himself standing alone in the church. The familiar scent of wood and incense filled the air, and the silence of the empty pews seemed almost oppressive. The church, once a sanctuary of certainty and conviction, now felt like a cavern of doubt. He paced the floor, the soft sound of his footsteps echoing in the space, as if he were walking in circles, trapped in his own thoughts. His wife's words had planted a seed of doubt, one that he could not ignore. But the more he tried to push it away, the more it grew. He found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about God, about sin, and about redemption. Was it really possible that God, in his infinite love, could offer mercy to all, even to those who had strayed so far from his path? Could there be room in his heart for even the most wretched sinner? And if so, what did that mean for the vision of the afterlife that he had always taught? The preacher knelt at the altar, his hands trembling as they rested on the cold stone. The weight of his own uncertainty pressed down on him, a burden he could no longer bear alone. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, though it felt different now, more like a plea for guidance than the confident declarations of faith he had once offered. God, he whispered, his voice barely audible, show me the way, help me understand your true nature. Is your love truly boundless, or have I been blind to your mercy all these years? Please grant me the wisdom to see the truth. For a long time he sat in silence, the only sound the faint rustling of his robes against the stone floor. The quiet of the church enveloped him, and in that stillness he felt something stir within him, a flicker of understanding, a glimmer of the divine that had eluded him for so long. It was as though the silence itself was speaking to him, offering a truth beyond words, beyond doctrine in that moment. The preacher realized that his faith had been narrow, confined by the boundaries he had set for it. He had focused so much on the wrath of God that he had neglected the depth of his love. Perhaps, he thought, the true nature of God's mercy was not something that could be fully understood through doctrine or punishment, but something that could only be experienced, felt in the quiet moments of connection with the divine. With this realization, the preacher stood up, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, that breaking free from the old ways of thinking would require courage and vulnerability. But he also knew that the path he was now beginning to walk was one of truth, one that would lead him to a deeper understanding of God's love, not through fear, but through compassion. As he left the church that evening, the night air felt different, warmer, as though the universe itself was offering him a quiet embrace. The stars above twinkled in the sky, their light gentle and reassuring. The world seemed to be filled with new possibilities, and the preacher felt a quiet hope rising within him, something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with his journey. As the days passed, the preacher found himself torn between the old certainties that had shaped his life and the new understanding that was slowly emerging in his heart. The more he thought about his wife's words, the more he realized how narrow his view of God had been. He had always focused on the consequences of sin, on the eternal punishment awaiting the wicked. But now he wondered if he had missed something crucial, the boundless love that could forgive, heal, and redeem even the most lost souls. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, the preacher went for a walk through the village. The streets were quiet, and the sounds of the evening distant birdsong, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, seemed to fill the air with a sense of peace. It was the kind of evening that invited reflection, the kind that made the heart slow down and open up. The preacher walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his thoughts heavy. He passed the houses of his neighbors, each one lit with the warm glow of lamps, the sounds of children laughing, families gathered for dinner. As he walked, he realized that the people in these homes were not so different from him. They, too, were struggling with their own doubts, their own fears, their own questions about life and faith. They, too, were trying to make sense of the world around them, trying to live good lives in the face of uncertainty. He stopped for a moment in front of a small cottage, where a woman sat on the porch, rocking gently in a chair, her hands busy with knitting. She looked up as he approached, and gave him a warm smile. The preacher greeted her and stood for a moment, watching the steady rhythm of her knitting needles. It struck him how simple and peaceful her life seemed, how rooted she was in the world around her. "You look troubled, Pastor," the woman said, her voice gentle and kind. "Something on your mind?" The preacher hesitated. He wasn't sure how to express the turmoil that had been churning inside him. But as he looked at her, he felt a sudden urge to speak, to share the confusion that had been weighing him down. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice soft, "about everything I've taught, everything I've preached. For so long, I've believed that God's love was only for those who followed the right path, who obeyed the commandments. But now I'm not so sure. I'm beginning to wonder if I've been wrong. What if God's love is greater than I've ever understood? What if it's meant for everyone, even those who have gone astray?" The woman set her knitting aside and looked at him with a knowing expression. "You're asking the right questions," she said quietly, "and I believe that God's love is indeed greater than we can imagine. It's not about following the rules perfectly or living without sin. It's about opening our hearts to His love, to His grace, and allowing that love to transform us." The preacher felt a wave of relief wash over him. Her words were simple, but they carried a depth of wisdom that he hadn't expected. It was as though, in that moment, the weight of his doubts began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that." The woman smiled gently. "We all need reminders sometimes. God's love is not a reward for good behavior, Pastor. It's a gift that's always there, waiting for us to accept it." As the preacher continued his walk, he felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to understand that the journey was not about finding the right answers to all the questions. It was about learning to trust in the love that was already there, to open his heart to the grace that surrounded him, even in his moments of doubt. The sun had set, and the stars were beginning to twinkle in the sky. The world was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, the preacher felt at peace with himself. He wasn't sure where his journey would lead, but he knew that it would be a journey of love, a journey that would allow him to see the world and the people in it with new eyes. The preacher returned home that evening, but the peace he had felt during his walk did not last. As he stepped into his quiet home, the weight of the evening's sermon still lingered in his mind. The words he had spoken in the pulpit echoed in his thoughts like a relentless drumbeat, demanding to be reconsidered. He had preached of hellfire and damnation, warning his congregation of the eternal consequences of sin. And yet now, with the comforting warmth of his home surrounding him, the preacher couldn't shake the doubt that had taken root in his heart. His wife, as always, was sitting by the fire, knitting in the corner of the room. The soft glow of the firelight danced on her face, casting shadows that seemed to mimic the turmoil inside him. She looked up as he entered, her gentle eyes reading the unease in his expression. She had always been his anchor, the one person who could see through the mask of certainty he had worn for so long. And now, as he stood before her, he felt vulnerable, as though the very foundation of his beliefs was beginning to crumble. "You're troubled, my dear," she said, her voice soft, yet filled with understanding. "What's on your mind?" He sat down beside her, taking her hands in his. "I preached today," he began, his voice low, as though speaking the words aloud would somehow make them more real. "And I told them of hell, eternal fire and suffering for those who stray from God's path. I spoke with conviction, believing that I was speaking the truth, but now, now I'm not so sure." His wife nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always believed in the righteousness of your words, haven't you?" The preacher nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "Yes, but what if I've been wrong? What if God's love is not just for the righteous, but for all of us, even the lost ones? I preached of fire, of punishment, but is that truly the message of our Creator? Is it possible that we, as mere mortals, have misjudged him?" She looked at him with a gentle smile, her eyes filled with quiet compassion. "My love," she said softly, "perhaps it's not about judging others for their sins, but about offering them the grace that we, too, have received. You've always spoken of the wrath of God, but I believe His mercy is far greater." The preacher closed his eyes for a moment, allowing her words to settle in his heart. The idea was foreign to him, almost too simple to grasp, but there was a warmth in her voice, a comfort that he had not felt in his own sermons. Could it be true? Was God's mercy truly boundless, even for those he had so fervently condemned? He looked at his wife, his eyes searching for answers. But what about the wicked? the ones who refuse to repent, the ones who live in sin year after year. What about them? His wife placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. I believe that God sees the heart, not just the outward actions. He knows the struggles, the pain, the reasons behind our choices. It is not for us to condemn, but to love, to guide, to forgive. The preacher felt a wave of emotion rise within him, and for the first time in years, he felt his heart soften, his rigid beliefs beginning to bend. The certainty he had always held so tightly was now slipping through his fingers. And in its place was something deeper, something more elusive, but infinitely more comforting: compassion, grace, and mercy. The weight of his guilt, his belief that he had been a harbinger of wrath, began to lift, replaced by the possibility of something far more profound. But how do I reconcile this with everything I've preached? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How do I explain this to the people who look to me for guidance? How do I shift from preaching judgment to preaching love? His wife smiled again, her eyes full of quiet wisdom. By living it, by showing them that love and mercy are stronger than fear and punishment. They will learn from your example, from your heart. If you believe in the power of grace, then let that be your message. The preacher sat quietly, his mind swirling with new possibilities. He had always believed that God was a figure of divine justice, but now, in his heart, he felt the stirrings of a different truth. Perhaps God's love was not as simple as the law, as the fire of judgment he had so often preached about. Perhaps it was something more complicated, more beautiful, something that could heal, redeem, and transform. As the evening deepened, the preacher felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace that came from letting go of old, rigid beliefs and embracing a deeper understanding of God's mercy. It was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of something new, something beautiful. He turned to his wife, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "Thank you," he said softly. "You've given me much to think about." She nodded, her smile warm and understanding. "You'll find the way, my love. I believe in you." And as they sat together, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the preacher allowed himself to rest in the quiet certainty that he was no longer alone in his doubts. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time he felt ready to walk it with an open heart. The next morning, the preacher awoke with a sense of quiet anticipation, as though something profound had shifted within him. The thoughts from the previous evening, his wife's gentle words, the dawning realization of the vastness of God's mercy lingered in his mind, refusing to be pushed away. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting golden beams across the room, and for the first time in a long while, the preacher felt the warmth of the day seep into his soul. It was as if the new light had come not just from the sun, but from within him, illuminating the path ahead. His wife, as always, had already risen and was busy preparing the morning meal. She moved gracefully around the kitchen, humming softly. As she worked, there was a quiet peace in the air, a tranquility that he had never fully noticed before, but now felt keenly. He stood at the window, looking out over the village, the world still waking up, the rooftops bathed in soft morning light. The day stretched ahead, a blank canvas, and for the first time in what felt like years, the preacher felt a sense of hope fill him. There was work to be done, but it was no longer the burden it had once seemed. As he sat down at the table, His wife placed a warm cup of tea before him, the steam rising in delicate spirals. He looked at her, a mixture of gratitude and awe in his heart. She had always been the one to challenge him, to push him to see beyond the surface of things. And now she had given him something more, something that was not easily defined, but something that felt like a quiet understanding, a shared truth that had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. "You're quiet this morning," she said, sitting down beside him with a knowing smile. "I can see the wheels turning in your mind." The preacher chuckled softly, his voice still filled with wonder. "I've been thinking about what you said. I realize now that I've spent so much time talking about judgment, about the punishment for sin, that I've forgotten the most important part of the story, the love of God. I've been preaching from a place of fear, when I should have been preaching from a place of hope." His wife nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. "And now you understand," she said softly. "Now you see that love isn't something to be earned, to something that's always been there, always waiting for us to accept it. It's in every moment, in every breath we take, in the way we treat one another." The preacher nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep within him. It was simple, really, but it was also profound. He had spent so many years trying to earn God's love, trying to prove that he was worthy of it, and in doing so, he had overlooked the truth that God's love was never something to be earned. It was freely given, always present, a gift that needed only to be accepted. He looked out the window again, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The village was alive with the soft sounds of morning, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the trees. Life was unfolding in its quiet, beautiful rhythm, and for the first time the preacher felt a deep sense of belonging. He was part of this world, part of this life, part of the endless dance of existence. The boundaries he had once placed around himself, around God, were beginning to dissolve, replaced by a sense of unity, of connection. "Do you think the people will understand?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Do you think they'll accept the message of love instead of fear?" His wife smiled, reaching across the table to place her hand on his. "They will, in time," she said gently. "But first, you must show them. You must live it. Let them see it in your actions, in the way you speak to them, the way you listen, the way you love. That's how you'll show them what God's love truly looks like." The preacher sat back, absorbing her words. He had spent so much of his life focused on preaching, on delivering the message in the most dramatic, most convincing way possible. But now he understood that the message didn't need to be shouted from the pulpit. It needed to be lived quietly and humbly, through acts of kindness, through the way he treated others, through the way he embodied the very love he had once only preached about. As the morning light grew stronger, the preacher felt a new sense of purpose rising within him. It was not the purpose of condemnation, of warning against damnation, but the purpose of hope for redemption, hope for healing, hope for the deep, transformative power of love. The world outside was waiting, and he was ready to begin the next chapter of his journey. He stood up, a renewed sense of determination in his heart. "I will speak to them differently," he said softly, almost to himself. "I will show them the love of God, not through fear, but through grace." His wife smiled, the warmth of her love radiating across the room. "I believe in you," she said, her voice filled with unwavering faith. "You will find your way." And with that, the preacher stepped into the world, ready to share the truth of God's love, not as a judgment, but as a gift. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it was one he now felt ready to take, with an open heart and a renewed spirit. As the weeks went by, the preacher began to change in subtle ways. The words he once spoke so confidently from the pulpit now felt different to him. No longer did he feel the need to condemn or threaten. Instead, his sermons began to carry a new message, one of love, mercy, and grace. His once fiery rhetoric had softened, replaced by a gentle warmth, a calm understanding that reached deep into the hearts of his congregation. People began to notice. The hardened expressions they had once worn in his presence were slowly replaced with smiles, with eyes that seemed to light up with hope. But despite this shift, the preacher still carried a quiet weight in his heart. His wife had shown him the truth, but now he had to live it, to embody it fully, and there were moments when doubt crept back in. He had grown up in a world where God's love had been defined by fear, where the fire of hell was always present in the background, threatening to consume those who faltered. He had preached about sin, about punishment, about the eternal consequences of straying from the path. Letting go of all that was not an easy task. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the village, the preacher stood at the window of his study, looking out at the quiet world. His wife was in the next room, preparing for the evening meal, her presence a quiet comfort. The air was cool, and the soft rustling of the leaves outside seemed to carry a message of peace. It was in these quiet moments that the preacher felt most vulnerable, most aware of the depth of the change he was undergoing. He had once believed that his duty was to save souls, to direct them away from sin and toward salvation. But now he realized that his duty was not to save others, but to show them the way to walk beside them on their journey, to offer them a hand of compassion rather than a finger of judgment. He thought of the people in his congregation, the families who came to him for guidance, the individuals who sought his counsel. What had they come for? Had they come for a message of fear, or had they come because they, too, longed for something more? The preacher sighed softly, his hand resting on the window frame. The world outside was so still, so quiet, and yet within him a storm still raged. He knew that the change he sought could not be forced, could not be rushed. It was something that had to be lived, not preached. The message was clear: love, grace, mercy. But how could he make it real for those who had been raised on fear, on the promise of eternal damnation? How could he show them that God's love was greater than any punishment, that his forgiveness was more powerful than any sin? As if answering his unspoken question, the preacher's wife entered the room, carrying a tray of bread and cheese. She set it down on the table beside him, her gentle presence soothing the restlessness inside him. She didn't speak at first, simply sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The silence between them was comfortable, as it always had been. They had been through so much together: joy, sorrow, doubt, and faith. And now, in this quiet moment, he felt a deep connection to her, a sense of unity in their shared understanding. "Do you still doubt?" she asked softly, her voice filled with both tenderness and knowing. He looked at her, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe that God's love is as boundless as you say it is. want to believe that there is grace for everyone, no matter what they've done. But the fear that has been with me for so long still lingers, and sometimes I'm not sure how to let it go." His wife smiled gently, her eyes filled with quiet wisdom. "You don't have to let go of everything all at once," she said softly. "Faith is a journey, not a destination. It's okay to have doubts, to question. But remember this: God's love is not something we have to earn. It's a gift, freely given. And the more you embrace that love, the more you will begin to see it in everything around you, in the people you meet, in the beauty of the world, in the small acts of kindness that touch your heart." The preacher closed his eyes, letting her words settle in his soul. He knew that the path ahead would not be without struggle. But for the first time, he felt a quiet confidence that he had not felt before. The journey of faith was not about having all the answers, but about trusting in God's love and letting that love guide him forward. As the evening light faded, the preacher sat in silence, feeling the warmth of his wife's presence beside him. The world outside was darkening, but in his heart a new light was beginning to shine, one that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. He wasn't sure where the journey would take him, but for the first time he was ready to walk it with open arms and an open heart. The days passed, and the preacher found himself increasingly restless. Though his heart had opened to the idea of God's boundless love, his mind could not fully release the grip of the fear he had once so tightly embraced. He spent his days reflecting on his wife's words, on the messages of grace and mercy that he now believed to be true. Yet there was an internal conflict that continued to stir within him. The doctrine of damnation, of eternal punishment for the wicked, had been a central part of his life's work, and now it felt as though the very foundation of his existence was being questioned. How could he preach mercy when so many had been taught to fear? One afternoon, while sitting in his study, the preacher found himself lost in thought, staring out the window at the quiet village. The world outside seemed so peaceful, so simple, yet within him there was a storm brewing. His gaze shifted to the church steeple in the distance, and the familiar sound of the bells rang out, calling the people to prayer. He wondered how many of them shared his doubts, how many were living in the same quiet conflict, unsure of what they had been taught, searching for a faith that could heal rather than condemn. He rose from his chair, pacing the room as his thoughts swirled in his mind. Was it really possible to let go of everything he had believed for so long? To preach not of fire and brimstone, but of love and compassion? And if he did, what would happen to those who had been raised to fear the consequences of their actions? Could he truly offer them a new way of seeing God, one that did not rely on punishment, but on redemption? The uncertainty gnawed at him, threatening to unravel the peace he had worked so hard to cultivate in the quiet solitude of the afternoon. The preacher realized that the fear of judgment was not just something he had preached, it was something that had taken root in his own heart. His life had been built on the belief that God was an angry judge, that salvation was a reward for the righteous and a punishment for the wicked. But now he was beginning to see that this view had only kept him and others locked in a cycle of fear and shame. What if the path to salvation was not through fear, but through love? What if God's grace was not earned by deeds, but offered freely, regardless of one's past? As these thoughts began to settle into his heart, the preacher felt an overwhelming sense of both relief and sorrow. The sorrow came from the realization that he had spent so many years perpetuating a message of fear, unknowingly causing harm to those who had come to him for guidance. But the relief came from the knowledge that change was possible, that a new path lay before him. It was not a path of certainty, but one of trust. Trust in God's love, trust in the power of mercy, and trust that, with time, others would come to understand this new way of thinking. The preacher closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of his thoughts wash over him. When he opened them again, he saw his wife standing in the doorway, her face gentle, her eyes full of understanding. She had always known when he was troubled, when the weight of his own thoughts became too much for him to bear. Without a word, she walked over to him and placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch a silent reassurance that she was with him, that they were in this together. "I've been thinking," the preacher said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been thinking about what you said, about God's love. I want to believe it, truly I do. But it's hard to let go of everything I've been taught." His wife smiled softly, her eyes full of compassion. "It's not easy," she said, "but I believe in you, and I believe that the journey you're on will bring you to a place of peace. You're not alone in this." The preacher took a deep breath, the weight of his doubts still heavy, but lighter now than before. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time he felt a sense of direction. It was not the path of certainty, nor the path of fear, but the path of a love that transcended judgment, of a love that could heal and redeem, no matter the mistakes of the past. He knew that he would not have all the answers, but he also knew that he no longer needed to have them. The journey itself was the answer. As the evening drew near and the soft light of the setting sun bathed the room in warmth, the preacher sat beside his wife, feeling a peace that had eluded him for so long. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time he felt ready to walk it with an open heart as the days turned into weeks. The preacher found himself increasingly drawn to the simplicity of life around him. The world, with all its beauty and complexity, had once seemed overwhelming, filled with questions and doubts that seemed impossible to answer. But now, in the quiet of his home, and in the moments of stillness that came with his walks through the village, he was beginning to see the world through new eyes. The beauty of the everyday, the quiet rhythm of life, had become a reflection of something much greater than he had ever imagined. And in this simplicity, he found a peace that he had long been searching for. One evening, as the last rays of the setting sun cast a soft glow over the village, the preacher stood at the window, gazing out at the peaceful scene before him. The houses, bathed in the golden light of dusk, seemed to glow with warmth and life. Children played in the streets, their laughter ringing through the air, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted from the nearby bakery. The world was full of small, beautiful moments that, until now, he had overlooked. The simple acts of kindness, the quiet joy of a peaceful evening, seemed to speak louder than any sermon he had ever delivered. It was in these moments that the preacher felt the most connected to the world around him. The vast, unknowable mysteries of life and faith seemed to fade away, replaced by the understanding that the divine was not found in grand gestures or lofty ideals, but in the quiet moments of connection and compassion that we shared with one another. The love of God, he now realized, was not something distant or unreachable. It was something that lived within us, in the way we treated others, in the way we embraced the beauty of the world. He thought of the people in his congregation, the families he had once judged, the sinners he had condemned in the name of righteousness. He thought of the children who played in the streets, the elderly couple who sat hand in hand on their porch, the young woman who tended the flowers in her garden. They were all part of the same story, all part of the same cycle of life, love, and growth. And in that moment, he understood that no one was beyond redemption. No one was beyond the love of God. It was not the outward actions that mattered, but the heart, the willingness to open up to the grace and love that were always present, always waiting to be embraced. The preacher sat down at his desk, the quiet of the evening settling around him like a comforting blanket. He had spent so many years preaching fire and brimstone, warning his congregation of the dangers of sin, of eternal punishment. But now he felt a deep sense of peace in his heart, a peace that came from knowing that love was the true path to salvation. It was not the fear of punishment that would lead people to God, but the warmth of his love, the gentle pull of his grace. As he sat there, the evening deepening into night, the preacher reflected on the journey he had undertaken. He had been so sure of himself, so certain of the righteousness of his teachings. But now, with a heart open to love and mercy, he realized that there was still so much to learn. The journey was not over. It had only just begun. But he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He was no longer afraid of the uncertainty, of the questions that still lingered. He knew that as long as he walked with love in his heart, he would be guided by the light of God's mercy. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees in the distance, and the stars began to twinkle in the dark sky above. The world was quiet now, the day's bustle fading into the stillness of the night. And in that quiet, the preacher felt a sense of peace settle into his soul. The love of God was everywhere, in the stars above, in the earth beneath his feet, in the people around him. It was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced, something that was always there, always waiting to be discovered. With a deep breath, the preacher stood up, feeling the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. He was ready to share this new understanding with the world, to walk alongside his congregation, not as a judge, but as a guide, offering them the love and grace that he had come to understand so deeply. The path ahead was still unclear, but he no longer feared it. He knew that, with love in his heart and a trust in God's mercy, he would find his way. The following morning, the preacher rose with a quiet sense of determination, the weight of his thoughts from the night before still lingering in the air. The conversation with his wife, the questions he had been grappling with, had left an indelible mark on him. He had never been one to shy away from difficult truths. But this new path he was considering was not one that could be walked in haste. It required reflection, patience, and, above all, a heart willing to embrace the very thing he had spent years resisting, unconditional love. As he stood at the window, gazing out at the village below, he felt the familiar peace that always accompanied the early morning. The sun was rising slowly, casting a soft, golden light over the rooftops, and the air was cool and crisp with the promise of a new day. The birds were already awake, their songs filling the silence of the dawn, and the world seemed to stretch out before him like an open canvas, ready to be painted with new understanding. new purpose. His wife, as usual, had already prepared breakfast. The smell of freshly baked bread and strong coffee filled the house, a comforting reminder of the simplicity and beauty of life. She was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she worked, her movements graceful and sure. He could hear the soft clink of utensils, the gentle stir of pots and pans. There was a quiet harmony in the rhythm of her actions, and it reminded him of the rhythm of life itself, the ebb and flow, the moments of stillness and of motion, the small acts of kindness and care that made the world turn. As he sat down at the table, his wife placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, her eyes filled with a gentle knowing. She had always understood him in a way that no one else could. It was as if, through her quiet presence, she had always seen the truth he had struggled to recognize in himself. She knew, as he did now, that love, true, unconditional love, was the answer, not just for him, but for everyone. The love of God was not a narrow, rigid thing. It was vast, it was boundless, and it was meant to be shared. Asterisk, you've been up early, she said softly, as she sat down beside him, her voice warm and soothing. What's on your mind this morning? The preacher sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been thinking about everything, about the way I've been preaching, the way I've been living. For so long, I've focused on sin, on judgment, on punishment. But now I see that I've been missing something. I've been missing the heart of it, all the love that God has for all of us, no matter who we are or what we've done. His wife smiled gently, her eyes filled with compassion. You're beginning to see it, she said softly. You're beginning to see that God's love isn't something to be earned. It's a gift, freely given. It's not about what we do, but about who we are, about our willingness to accept that love and share it with others. The preacher nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deeply within him. For so long, he had believed that salvation was something that had to be earned, that it was a reward for righteous living. But now he realized that it was not a reward at all. It was a gift that was always there, always waiting to be accepted. And it wasn't just for the good and the faithful. It was for everyone, even the lost, even the sinner. God's love was infinite, and it reached beyond the boundaries of human judgment. Asterisk, I've been so focused on the rules, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I've spent my whole life preaching about what people should and shouldn't do, about what's right and wrong. But now I see that the real message, the message that I should have been sharing, is the message of love. Love that is unconditional, that doesn't judge, that doesn't punish. Love that forgives, that heals. His wife took his hand in hers, her touch soft and reassuring. That's the message we all need to hear, she said, not just in words, but in actions. Show them, Pastor. Show them through your life, through your kindness, your patience, your forgiveness. That's how they'll understand. That's how they'll see the truth. The preacher sat back in his chair, the weight of her words filling him with a quiet sense of resolve. The journey he had been on, the journey of faith, was far from over, but now it felt different. He had been so focused on the destination, goal of righteousness, of salvation, that he had lost sight of the journey itself. The path ahead was not about achieving perfection, but about living in love, about showing others that love through every action, every word, every moment of grace. The preacher rose from the table, his heart light and full of purpose. There was work to be done, but it was not work born from obligation or fear. It was work born from love, from the deep, unshakable understanding that love was the foundation of everything. He was ready to walk this new path, to share the message of God's love with others, not as a preacher of judgment, but as a humble servant of grace. And as he stepped out into the sunlight, the world seemed to open up before him, full of possibility, full of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was no longer one of fear. It was a road of love, a road that would lead him and others to a place of peace. That night, as the preacher lay in bed, the quiet weight of the day's events settled over him. The church had been filled with people, but the words he spoke had not been the ones he had planned. Instead, they had been the words that had come from his heart, words of mercy, of grace, of forgiveness. He had spoken not of damnation, but of love, not of punishment, but of redemption. For the first time in his life, the preacher felt that he had spoken the truth that lived deep within him, a truth that he had been too afraid to express before. As he lay there, his wife beside him, the soft sound of her breathing, a quiet comfort, the preacher felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The weight of judgment had lifted from his shoulders, and in its place he felt light, as though he had shed a heavy burden. The world outside was still, the stars twinkling softly in the night sky, and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees seemed to echo the quiet peace that had settled in his heart. For the first time in years, the preacher felt that he was not alone. He felt the presence of God, not as a judge, but as a loving parent, offering him the grace to be imperfect, the grace to grow, the grace to live without fear. He had spent so many years trying to understand God through the lens of punishment, but now he realized that God's love was far more profound than he had ever imagined. It was not a love that demanded perfection, but one that offered compassion, understanding, and forgiveness. As he drifted off to sleep, the preacher felt a deep sense of gratitude fill his heart. Gratitude for the journey he had taken, for the doubts and struggles that had led him to this moment of clarity, and for the love of his wife who had shown him the way. He knew that the path ahead would not always be easy, but he was no longer afraid of it. The journey was not about finding the right answers, but about living in love, about walking alongside others with compassion and kindness. The preacher awoke the next morning to the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. The world outside was waking up, the birds singing their morning songs, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The air was fresh and full of possibility, and the preacher felt a quiet joy stir within him. Today was a new day, a day to continue his journey, a day to share the love of God with the world in a way he had never done before. As he stepped outside, he felt the warmth of the sun on his face, and for the first time he embraced it with open arms. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but the preacher knew that he was no longer walking it alone. God's love, the love that had been with him all along, would guide him, and he would share it with others, not through words of judgment, but through actions of grace and compassion. And so the preacher walked forward into the day, into the world, with a heart full of love and hope. He had found his path, and it was not a path of fear, but of peace. He knew that the road ahead would be long, but it would be a road worth walking, a road of love, of understanding, and of grace. The preacher had found the true message of God's love, and it was one that he would carry with him, sharing it with everyone he met, in every word, in every action, in every moment, and in that quiet moment, as he walked toward the horizon. The preacher felt a profound peace fill his soul. The journey had begun, and it was a journey of love.